Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Creedal. It's a crazy world out there. Hopefully you're not panicking about drones all up and down the East Coast, especially in the state of New Jersey. I don't think this is anything to worry about. I'm not going to spend much time talking about it at all. This is not the focus of today's conversation, but it has been making me think about mass hysteria as essentially a common feature of humanity, and mass hysteria being a function of our chronic existential angst as the human race. And that chronic existential angst being a function of our placelessness, our refusal to recognize our place in the world with respect to God who created the world. So Advent's a great time for us to step back and reassess and place our ultimate hope in the only one who can ultimately, at the end, save us. So that's the first thing from Advent. That's my very brief reflection instigated by the drones. But I've also been thinking in Advent about Jesus Christ's incarnation. This is, of course, what we celebrate in Advent. This is what we look forward to, both the incarnation 2,000 years ago when Jesus Christ first took on flesh, but also the second coming of Jesus Christ when he will return in glory. That's about our ultimate hope. The incarnation is about our initial hope, how Jesus made this future possible for us. By condescending, by taking on flesh, he took on our humanity and elevated our humanity. And we have this inherent human dignity that is given to us by God. There are many attacks on that human dignity from all sides today. It's very difficult to live as a Christian. We obviously have plenty of freedoms in the United States, and I'm very, very grateful for those. But all around the world, the secular values of progressivism are constantly advancing, and they hold and preach a message very different from the Christian message of human dignity. And so we have to be really diligent in upholding that message in all corners of the world. And what I want to talk about today is assisted suicide. If you've been paying attention to the news, you've probably seen that the UK Parliament had what's called a second reading of a bill on assisted suicide, and they passed that second reading of that bill. Now, if you're wondering what second reading means, the UK Parliament has a parallel system to the United States Congress in passing bills, in that they have to originate in one of the chambers, either the House of Commons, which is the lower chamber, or the House of Lords, and then they're presented in committee form and then considered by the whole body. That's the kind of the US Congress position. In the UK, it's a little bit different. The bills go to a first reading and a second reading in front of the entire body, and then are taken into committee and reworked and modified and edited, and then considered again by the entire House before going to the next House for eventual passage. And then the final culmination is what's called royal assent. And I had a little graphic of this, but for some reason, my screen sharing is not working. So unfortunately, I may not be able to do that. But that's the process. This bill was passed at second reading by a fairly substantial majority. So it does seem like, at least at this point of the process, that bill has majority support in the House of Commons. It would not be surprising if it had the same in the House of Lords, and would obviously not be surprising if it became law in the UK. This would upend the 1961 Act that currently prohibits and outlaws assisted suicide. And so this would be really a giant sea change for people in the UK. Now, I want to dive into the UK one just a little bit more because it illustrates a few things that I'll talk about later in this discussion. But I also want to figure out my screen sharing. So bear with me for one moment, and I will see if I can do that. Great success. We have solved this technical difficulty. Okay, here is what it looks like. This is what I was talking about. The bill starts in one house. There's a first reading, a second reading, which is what it has passed, and then it is now at committee stage. Now, in the interest of fullness, I read the bill itself just so I could understand what is in it and be able to speak with some degree of knowledge about it. And I'll share that also with you here. So this is a PDF of the bill itself. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about this bill. Okay, so here's the bill. A bill to allow adults who are terminally ill, subject to safeguards and protections, to request and be provided with assistance to end their own life and for connected purposes. Be it enacted by the King's most excellent majesty. I love this language, by the way. It's so cool that the parliamentary monarchy system in the UK uses this. By and with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal and commons in this present parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. Okay, so here we go. Now we're outlining what exactly the bill is. And it's not too long of a bill, but I will just hit the high points. Number one, assisted dying. And these are definitions, essentially, right? So what is a terminally ill person? One, they have the capacity to make a decision to end their own life. Two, they are aged 18 or over at the time, so this does not apply to minors. Three, they're a resident of the UK. And then two, that there are these steps that have been taken to establish that a person has a clear, settled, and informed wish to end their own life, and has made the decision that they wish to end their own life voluntarily and has not been coerced or pressured by any other person into making it. Okay, so this is obviously an important clause, and we'll come back to that. Not necessarily these words, but this idea of the sort of coercion. Okay. And then what is a terminal illness? For the purposes of this act, a person is terminally ill if they have an inevitably progressive illness, disease, or medical condition which cannot be reversed by treatment, and the person's death in consequence of that illness, disease, or medical condition can reasonably be expected within 6 months. We'll come back to this idea as well, but for right now, this is fairly narrowly defined. Essentially, there's some sort of progressive illness that we can't treat and that we expect to induce death within 6 months. Okay, so you can think of a terminal cancer, right? Late stage, et cetera. Okay. Now, so there are those, and then a caveat here that there's a caveat here that basically, if you can, temporarily alleviate this or temporarily relieve the symptoms of one that is going to advance period, that's not a treatment that's regarded as reversing that illness. So this person still qualifies. But 3, if the person has a mental disorder within the meaning of this Mental Health Act or a disability within the meaning of this act, and I have not read these acts, but I assume they're fairly narrowly tailored descriptions of mental disorders and disabilities, then they are not, they cannot be considered to be terminally ill as this definition describes. Okay. Now, this is the initial discussions phase, right? So when someone has decided they want to talk about ending their life, they might want to do this. They have to have a discussion with a registered medical practitioner. Now, this is good. There's no duty levied on medical practitioners to have this conversation if they don't want to have this conversation. In other words, if you're a doctor and you object on the basis of conscience to this idea of assisted suicide, you can just say, nope, I don't have those conversations with people. I don't want to do it. And the law actually, as written, protects you from that, which is good. As written. Now, this obviously could all change, and it probably will change in the future if this becomes law. Okay, but this person, the medical practitioner, has to be a registered medical practitioner, meaning they have to be registered under the laws of the UK, et cetera, and they have to discuss all of these things: the diagnosis, the prognosis, the treatment available, the likely effect of it, any available palliative, hospice, or other care, et cetera. Okay, now these are fairly broad umbrellas to discuss. This is not much of a checklist, right? This is very broadly, not narrowly tailored directive for how the medical practitioner needs to discuss this, but that's what it says. Okay, then there's the request for assistance. The first declaration, this declaration is really when the person says, okay, I want to die, and I want to die in this manner with assistance from the state. So they have to do this. It has to be witnessed by the coordinating doctor. It has to be witnessed also by another person, and there are qualifications on who can qualify as that other doctor, the coordinating doctor, who can qualify as the other person, et cetera. Needs to be proof of identity to make sure that we don't have fraudulent deaths, et cetera. All good things to make sure of, but obviously the ultimate thing that's happening is never a good thing. And then the coordinating doctor has to make an assessment. And then there has to be a second opinion by an independent doctor, and that independent doctor can't be a relative of the person who's making the decision, et cetera. Right. So there are all these carve outs, all these rules. Again, I won't read all of these, but you certainly can. This is all online, and I'm showing you this. I'm certainly not attempting to hide any of it. It's just that I don't have the time to go through the entire thing. And so there's a further provision for assessing doctors. These doctors can assess the wishes, assess the person's condition in light of their wishes, right? Lots of conversation with the person is directed throughout this law, et cetera. If the independent doctor disagrees, there's, an opinion directed here from another independent doctor, et cetera. So there's all these rules about multiple people being involved, right? So there have to be multiple doctors involved, have to be multiple witnesses at every stage of this, et cetera. Okay. And then there's court approval. So then this whole petition goes to a court, right? So the person has made a declaration. Then there's a coordinating doctor. Then there's the independent doctor. Then they apply to the high court for a declaration that the requirements of this act have been met in relation to the first declaration. That's just the first declaration. The high court obviously evaluates this, continues to, or confirms if it is, in fact, all the requirements are met. And then there's the confirmation request for assistance in a second declaration, right? And there's a similar process here, but basically there's a period of time, a waiting period by which the person can change their mind. There's clearly just designed to be kind of a cooling off period. Maybe this person was just in the throes of agony and they were making a rash decision. But then with the benefit of at least 2 weeks of reflection, they realized, no, I don't want to end my life. There's so much to live for, et cetera. And so there's a whole other process after a period of time. Very easy to cancel this. All you have to do is give oral or written notice of the cancellation at any time to either the coordinating doctor or any registered medical practitioner from the GP practice. Now, remember that the UK has a nationalized health scheme, so every single person in the UK is assigned to a GP practice. Okay, so then the cancellation takes effect immediately, et cetera. Now, this gets a little dicey. There's a signing by proxy caveat. So if the person is unable to sign their own name by reason of physical impairments, right? So being unable to read, for example, they can authorize the proxy to sign on their behalf, and then the person can sign. So you can end up in this very strange situation in which a person is ostensibly wishing to die and clearly communicating that, but literally unable to sign their own name. And this is obviously a very strange carve out to me. It's strange that we give a carve out, for example, and say this can never apply. This whole act can never apply to mentally disabled individuals. But if you're unable to sign your own name and you can't read, then a proxy can do it for you. This just strikes me on its face as a very strange caveat. Okay, so then there's the recording of all these declarations. There are medical records made of this. Obviously, if there's a cancellation made, there's a record made of that. And then there's the provision of assistance to end life, which is quite the euphemism for saying murder or assisted suicide. But that's exactly what happens. There's a coordinating doctor who provides that person with an approved substance. The approved substance is provided directly and in person by the coordinating doctor to that person. They have to be clear that all of these 3 caveats are met. And then the person self-administers the approved substance. Okay. And that is that. There's other things for, how another doctor can provide assistance. Approved substance. This part of the act essentially outsources the approval of these substances to the Secretary of State. So let's just give this to the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy can make these regulations and they can specify which of the drugs we'll use to be the approved drugs for killing a human being. So this is very strange. This is just very this is all really couched in the language of I'm thinking of That Hideous Strength, the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. There's even the language of coordination, right? The coordinating doctor, and so there's the NICE, right? NICE, and everyone just thinks it's such a lovely institute. But what's really happening is they're putting a veneer of sort of bureaucratic professionalism and efficiency over these absolutely evil machinations, and it seems like that's exactly what's happening here. So there are the approved substances. The bureaucrats tell you, what exact poisons you can use. There's a final statement. You finally say, yep, I want to kill myself, et cetera. And there's that. Now there's this whole carve out, the protections for health professionals. We talked about this a little bit. And then there's a section on criminal liability for providing assistance. You can never be criminally liable for providing assistance here if you followed this law as stated. You cannot be civilly liable. I think it says you can't. Does not give rise to any civil liability. So there's no civil liability. So basically, as long as you're a doctor, as long as you're following the rules of this law, you cannot be sued in court. You cannot be found criminally guilty of anything that you've done for it. Now there are offenses, right? And so there are these things too, making sure that people follow this law who are not the doctors. So the doctors apply in a separate section. But these mostly have to do with the people who induce others to make this. So if you coerce someone to make a first or second declaration or not to cancel, then you are liable on conviction to go to prison for a term not exceeding 14 years, which is kind of strange because later on in here, if you're guilty of an offense here, and you basically want that person to die, you're coercing them to make a declaration because you want them to die, then you will go to prison for life. I'm not really sure what the scenario is in which someone would induce a false declaration but not intend death. So it's kind of a strange carve out here. But you can see where this is going, that basically if someone does induce a false statement, they could argue in court, I wasn't actually aiming at death, and it substantially reduces their sentence, possibly to a minimal one, since this is not a mandated minimum. This is actually a mandated maximum, not exceeding 14 years. Okay, and then there's some rules about transporting the approved substances. Well, that sounds so nice, doesn't it? And then inquest, death certification, et cetera. And that's essentially the gist of the bill there. So, and there's guidance for chief medical officers of hospitals, et cetera. But what I've read to you now is basically the gist of the bill. Okay, so right off the bat, we see a few problems there. As I talk more about assisted suicide, I think some of those problems will come again to the forefront. And so we'll talk about some more of those in depth as we go. Okay, now let's come back to the subject at hand and talk more about assisted suicide in general. Why is this a problem? I said at the outset of this podcast that this is always and everywhere a problem. There is no scenario in which I am supportive of assisted suicide. It is always bad, not just from a moral position, although it certainly is from that, but also from a policy position. It is bad policy, and we should not have assisted suicide. Now, the first argument for assisted suicide, in fact, there are entire organizations dedicated to advocacy for this, which is such a dark thing to do. But the lead one in the UK is called Dignity in Dying. I have their website pulled up here. I'm now sharing this, Dignity in Dying. We're building the biggest ever record of support for legalizing assisted dying. You can add your name there. Please do not. 84% of the public support the choice of assisted dying for terminally ill adults. But going back to my point about NICE, N-I-C-E, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. The chief way to build support around a bad idea is to frame it well, right? And so dignity in dying. If you go out on the street and you say, hey, I'm collecting signatures, do you think people should have dignity in dying? Of course, I think people should have dignity in dying. That doesn't actually mean anything in itself when you expand dignity in dying to also mean being able to choose the time and manner of their own death. But what this group does is they have named themselves Dignity in Dying, and then they offer these stats about why it's so necessary. Here are the facts. People in North America, 100 million people in North America have access to assisted dying. Why can't you? This is mostly Canada. 300 dying people end their own lives in this country every year. I don't know why that is a fact that should make you more compelled to agree with assisted suicide, but there it is. We already saw that set. 84% of people support it. 44% of people would break the law and help a loved one to die, risking 14 years in prison. Again, I don't know why that is a relevant statistic to whether or not we should make this happen. I mean, there are lots of people who would break the law. It doesn't mean we should change the law to allow them to do that. 80% of religious people support an assisted dying law. Again, not really sure what this is getting at, and I would love to see the framing of how this question was posed to these religious people, for example. This is also just such a broad assertion as to be almost meaningless. Like the fact that religious people are all the same. It's just one monolith. It's very strange. 86% of people with a disability support a change to the law. This is interesting. And this is actually maybe the most interesting stat on this sheet, because this makes me think two things. One, if this is all true, right now, I'd take it as where this is a true statistic, then 86 out of every 100 people who have a disability in the United Kingdom say, yes, I want to be able to choose the manner and place of my own death. That's incredibly sad. That tells me, though, not that we should actually give them the ability to choose the manner of their own death, but it tells me that we have a broken healthcare system that has said to them, your life is so miserable and meaningless that you have to be able to choose the manner and place of your own death. So that's a really stunning statistic and speaks to not to the need to pass this legislation, but to the need to have better healthcare overall. And if you know anything about the UK National Health System, I lived there. I was a beneficiary of the National Health System. I witnessed it firsthand, although not for anything crazy, just for couple GP visits. You know that it's not good. It is not an efficient system, and it is not good, especially at handling complex cases, the type of cases that would most be implicated in a, quote, death with dignity law. Right. So it's a little bit problematic, to say the least, to share some of these statistics around this. But all that said, I mean, most of those statistics don't actually go to the core crux of the issue. All right, which we should talk about now. Okay, so now I mentioned the UK. I also mentioned Canada. This has been happening in Canada for a long time. This is also happening all across Europe, and I have a couple stories or a couple statistics to cite from some of those jurisdictions. But before we do that, let's just go to the philosophical idea, right? The sanctity of life and human dignity. Dignity in Dying, the campaign whose website I was just sharing, they have liked to take the language of dignity, death with dignity, dying with dignity, and say that dignity really is about being the master of your own fate. But that's not really what dignity really is about either. Dignity is about treating someone well, right? When you think about a child who's in the hospital, or just a person in the hospital, right? When they are unable to move themselves, unable to carry out their own basic bodily functions, nurses are there for them. If you're in home hospice care, family members, close relatives are there to help you. And the assistance there actually recognizes and increases the dignity of the people who need that assistance, right? They don't lose their dignity simply because they can't do something. If you've ever torn your ACL or your Achilles heel, you know that you've been laid up in bed for at least a couple of weeks and probably in a walking boot or a knee brace for a long time thereafter. The fact that you're no longer as capable of running a marathon or you're not able to get out of your bed the morning after your surgery does in no way diminish your dignity, right? It certainly limits your autonomy because you can't do the things that you could do before, but it does not limit your dignity. This is a critical thing to understand, that autonomy and self-actualization potential, the ability to do the things you want to do, does not change your dignity. We have this totally backwards as a society, which is exactly why we look at disabled people and we think, wow, that's not a very dignified way to lose. And this is really, really destructive, not just for our day-to-day lives and the relationships that we build with our fellow human beings here, but it's really destructive for the way that we build our society. It's why Iceland can proudly state, we have no Down syndrome people in this country because we've essentially eliminated Down syndrome from the gene pool. And that's a very euphemistic way of saying we have aborted all of our Down syndrome babies. I mean, this is just horrific. But when you look at someone's ability to do something as directly correlative to their dignity, that's a problem. It also is why I got into an argument with a door knocker in my neighborhood who was caucusing for the Democrat who was running for state house in Indiana. And his position on abortion was completely incoherent. And we got into this discussion about it. And I tried to illustrate to him that even though an unborn baby in the mother's womb cannot survive, quote, on its own, that diminishes its dignity no more than his grandmother's dignity is diminished when she is laid up in a hospital bed and cannot feed herself, right? But we've bought into this idea that the ability to do the things you want to do is directly tied to your dignity. It is simply false. The sanctity of life comes from the creator of life, the author of life, and we have to recognize that and uphold it wherever we can. So we have to be really careful about advocating for this idea that the lowest among us have less dignity. Now, there's this idea of a slippery slope, right? And the slippery slope argument is directly tied to this idea of dignity. But the slippery slope says this: if we legalize assisted suicide for these people, even with all these safeguards in the bill, et cetera, eventually over time, that will expand. And indeed, that does happen. Let's go to Canada, right? Canada was the first North American country to legalize assisted suicide on a national basis. They call it, again, with the euphemisms, they call it MAID, M-A-I-D. And you can sense this, you can detect this really kind of demonic perversion of Mary's claim that she's a handmaid of the Lord to Canada, saying we're going to pass this wonderful legislation called MAID, which means just medical assistance in dying. And it's really just a cover for killing people, literally killing people. In Canada, last year, around 323,000 people died overall, total deaths in the state. 15,000 of those were assisted suicides under the MAID regime. That means that 1 in every 21 and a half deaths or so in Canada is assisted suicide, which is crazy. It's a staggering number. 1 in every 21 and a half deaths is an assisted suicide in Canada. So if you're making this argument that, we have to have this because it's really just about recognizing that people are in really bad agony up to the point of death, and we really just have to have a carve out for those very unique cases, that's not what's happened. That's not what's happened at all. On top of that, there is a report from the New Atlantis. I have this pulled up as well, and I'll share my screen. The New Atlantis is a journal on technology and bioethics that I highly recommend everyone check out. But this new report from them, just published last month, talks about Ontario. So this is just Ontario in Canada. This is not nationwide. But they have identified that Ontario's euthanasia regulators, the people who are responsible for making sure doctors and lay people follow the law on assisted suicide, have tracked 428 cases of possible criminal violations with respect to MAID. So this could be anything from people doing, fraudulent identity stuff with assisted suicide to coercing people to sign their declarations, and have not referred a single case to law enforcement. Right, and I can link this in the show notes, and you can check this out. I've read through this; it's really stunning, and really stunning and indicting and damning. But you cannot convince me that a society that tracks 428 cases of possible abuse of this system and refers not a single one of them to law enforcement is actually taking care of its responsibility seriously and caring about those who are least among us. So you can give me all this lip service about really helping those who are least among us and just the people who are in terrible agony and have no other way out and feel trapped. But if this is how you behave when people are actually circumventing the rules and abusing the rules, then you are telling me an awful lot. And so yeah, you can see impaired cognition, for example. I mean, instances of disabled adults who cannot really think through themselves about this decision being made to make the decision. Horrible stuff. So that's just in Canada, our neighbor to the north, a country that prides itself on being so advanced and evolved. That's what they're doing. That's how they are. That's how they are living out their assisted suicide regime. Truly awful things. So that's the slippery slope in reality, right? When we create this initial carve out for assisted suicide being legal, we immediately create opportunities for a bunch of people who don't quite fit that paradigm or quite fit that description to try to fit that description, right? And so you can imagine plenty of people who have a rich Aunt Joan, and Aunt Joan is going downhill, and she's got some pretty serious dementia, but we're gonna work with her to make sure she signs the document, and we're gonna get a doctor. Maybe we'll pay that doctor under the table to give his assessment, et cetera, and we'll pay the independent doctor to give his assessment. All this stuff, right? This can certainly happen. And if you don't think this can happen, you're simply naive. There's another way the slippery slope thing can happen, though, too. It's not just about people taking advantage of it, but it's really about people. It's really about the law itself changing over time, right? This is what happened in Canada as well. Canada's MAID program initially had more carefully tailored language like the one in the UK bill that we just read, right? And I don't know exactly what the language in the UK in Canada was, but I think it was more along the lines of what the UK had, which is basically like you have to have a terminal illness, you have to be reasonably expected to die within 6 months. This can't be treated by the normal treatments that we have. And over time, that has changed. So now Canada has expanded its criteria, and now you can qualify for assisted suicide if you have a non-terminal condition, if you have a certain type of mental illness, if you have severe depression in Canada. My understanding is that you can apply for and be granted medical assistance in dying, aka assisted suicide. The state will help you kill yourself if you have severe depression, which is such a wildly anti-human position to take. This is not just me being an alarmist, though. This is actually happening in real life. Again, this is another example. I'm going to share my screen. This is from The Guardian in the UK newspaper. This was a Dutch woman. So this has happened in the Netherlands as well. Here's a Dutch woman, 29 years old, granted euthanasia approval on grounds of mental suffering. Zoraya Terbeek, who has chronic depression, anxiety, trauma, and unspecified personality disorder, expected to end her life soon. I don't know what happened to her. I really hope she did an about face and realized life was worth living. But this is where we are. There's this young 29-year-old woman. She has unbearable mental suffering. And our solution for her is that we'll help her kill herself. We will help her kill herself. That's where we are with assisted suicide. This is what I'm talking about with the slippery slope. It is absolutely unconscionable that we are doing this to anyone, let alone young, otherwise healthy people who have mental problems. This is crazy. Okay. So that's the other part of the slippery slope. Now, I talked about the coercion thing. One thing I didn't mention is that vulnerable populations may feel especially they may face special pressure to sign a declaration that says, I want to kill myself. The thing is, when you treat people who are dying or who are disabled like they are burdens, they will feel like burdens. And no one wants to feel like a burden. That's an awful thing to feel. But when we as a society start making laws about how we need to make it easier for people to kill themselves, especially if they're suffering, especially if they're disabled, we send a message to the disabled people among us that their lives are not worth as much as our own. And that's a terribly sad thing to say. But you can imagine how a relative, right? I use the example of great Aunt Joan who has dementia. But let's use the example of Grandpa Billy, who's in a wheelchair, right? And the family had to spend some extra money to get a wheelchair adapted van for him, and they have to take him around to all his appointments. And because he has some disability, he has to use a catheter, for example, right? And his bedpan needs to be changed by his family, right? And he's living with his family, and they think he's a burden. and they don't embrace that burden willingly. They let him know that he's a burden. And eventually that's just a miserable existence for everyone, right? No one's joyful about taking care of the grandfather because they have no good perspective on human dignity and of interdependence among the generations. And he feels terrible because they always make him feel like he's a burden. They remind him that he's a burden, and they don't have any joy in helping him live. So when he says, I want to kill myself, or I want help killing myself, is that actually a free choice? I would say it's not a free choice. I would say that there's a significant amount of coercion involved, even if no one's holding a gun to Grandpa Billy's head and saying, you will sign this, right? There is coercion by virtue of the fact that the family has told him for years, we don't like you anymore. You're a burden to us, right? We should end this now. And so that's where the coercion, I think, will happen much more commonly, is not the gun to your head coercion, but really like, hey, grandpa, grandma, great grandpa, you're a burden to us. It's been really hard to take care of you. And eventually they get the message and they go to the state and say, hey, my family won't care for me willingly. It's miserable to be alive. I need to die. And if you expand that to just be, you can qualify for that. If you have bad depression, then so be it. The state will gladly give a stamp of approval, as Canada has done for 15,000 people in the last calendar year, which is crazy. All right, so lots of abuse in the systems, lots of potential for the laws to expand in scope very quickly, and lots of coercion, at least implicit coercion or de facto coercion, in a society that no longer values its disabled and the least among us. Okay. The fourth, I have friends who are palliative care doctors, and my understanding from palliative care is that good palliative care is very hard to do. Very few people do good palliative care, but that we know how to do it, that we know actually how, in the vast, vast, vast majority, if not all of instances, to be able to give someone an experience of death that is peaceful and largely without pain. Now, if you go on Twitter and you read some of the sort of online discourse around these things, you will see that people will tell stories of their aging relatives or their close friends who suffered through unimaginable pain at the end of their lives and really just wish they could take a way out. And I don't doubt that any of that's true. And of course, we should always respond to those stories with charity. And that must be a terrible thing to just know I have like 12 months of this road in front of me and I'm in agony every single day. And this is really, really tough. But two things. One, we should as a society also value suffering and recognize that embracing our cross does have real value in it, not just temporal value, although it has that, but also a spiritual, eternal value. But second, we really should recognize that when that happens, that should not be happening really ever or almost never. And if it does, that's almost always an indication that the palliative care is bad and we are not exercising palliative care in the ways that we need to be. Now, why do I mention that in this context? Well, one, because we need to have good faith arguments, and we need to have good faith arguments about what is and is not possible in palliative care, because it is not acceptable to say, look, we have tons of people who are in agony-inducing states for months or years at a time, and we have no way of helping them, and the only way to help them is to kill them, right? That's simply not true. It's simply not true. I hope to have a palliative care doctor on soon to talk more about this. So we have to have good faith arguments about that. The second thing is if assisted suicide becomes an easy button, and so when we have a difficult case, we have an agony-inducing case, we have a case where someone's going to be alive for 6 months or 12 months, maybe even longer, but they're just going to be in pain a lot of the time, we need to have the palliative resources to help them not simply be in agony for 18 months. And if we have this easy button of just hitting assisted suicide every time, oh, yep, that's going to be really tough for us to do. You're going to be in agony for 12 months. Let's just kill you. Let's get you out the door. You can make this decision. It's going to be tough if you stay alive, so we'll just kill you and get you out the door. How's that sound? Instead of doing that and hitting the easy button, what if we invest resources into palliative care? I can't find a source for this. I'm looking for it, but it's from a source that I trust on Twitter. He said that after the UK Parliament voted to confirm this second reading, the bill at this second reading, 5 minutes later, they voted down a measure to increase funding for palliative care. I can't confirm that, so I don't want to report that as true. I would love it if one of my listeners knows that and get me the source. I've asked this person for this source. I can't confirm it, but if true, that illustrates what I'm talking about, right? That, when we have this easy button for addressing these things via assisted suicide, this ghoulish means of violating human dignity, then we're less willing, we're less incentivized to say, let's actually develop real good palliative care. So that's the other thing, right? Unintended consequences for palliative care. So now we've talked about this, the human dignity argument. Our bodies are not our own. They're not linked to the abilities we have. We talked about the slippery slope, how the law will expand over time and open up the criteria for assisted suicide to a much broader list than we initially start with. We've talked about the possibility for coercion, and we talked about unintended consequences for palliative care. There's another thing as well. This is really kind of a social effect, and that is that we abandon the virtue of hope. And I was thinking about this as I was looking at some of the discourse around assisted suicide, and someone was on Twitter, and they were asked, "Have you lived with a terminally ill person? It's a genuine question. No mouse here." This person responded, and I'm going to share this image as well so you can see this. So the question, have you ever really seen this? Because I've seen a terminally ill person and it's absolutely horrible what they go through, and no one should ever have to do that. This person says, "Yes, my dad. I never saw anyone so ill. His chemo vomit was so toxic it melted my mother's wedding ring. He was given 6 months in 1990. He'll be 84 on Boxing Day, currently helping my mom who had a hip operation last week." This is spectacular. I mean, this is spectacular. Miracles do happen. And that may sound Pollyanna-ish, that may sound overly optimistic, but it is true. Miracles do happen. Probably most of you listening know at least one person who has had a similar situation where the doctor finds a mass in the abdomen and they go in for the scans and it's gone. Or they're given 6 months to live and they end up living 12 more years. These things happen. So it is certainly not the case that any of us in the medical profession or outside the medical profession can say with any certainty what our day or hour is. None of us knows the day or the hour. None of us knows how many days we have remaining on this earth. And so when we structure these things, these laws around these not arbitrary, but certainly unknown ideas around how much more time you have to live, nobody knows. We're discounting medical advancements. We're discounting lifestyle things or just unexplained things. We're certainly discounting miracles, which do happen. And when we do that, we discount hope. We lose hope as a society. I do not want to live in a society that has lost all of its hope. But when we give into this and we just create ways for people to kill themselves, we are, in fact, giving up hope. Hope is one of the 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. We need hope. We need hope in a society. And as Christians, we are people of hope. I talked about this at the beginning of the podcast. Advent is a season of hope. We place our hope ultimately in Jesus Christ. Our hope is not in ourselves. It is in Jesus Christ. It is Jesus Christ who says what the day or the hour is. It is not for us to say. We are not actually autonomous with respect to that. So miracles do happen. We don't want to lose the virtue of hope. We also don't want to lose this theme in medical ethics that I fear we're already losing or have really greatly lost. Doctors do a lot of harm these days. But the original idea in medicine was to do no harm and to get the patient to health, right? If you look at the Hippocratic Oath, you will see a lot of things in here that doctors today do not do. But chief among them is not administering poisons. Again, I'm going to share a screen here. This is just the Hippocratic Oath on Wikipedia. All right, so it's kind of great. There's obviously some ancient stuff in here from Hippocrates, but there's stuff about the teacher and all this, using dietary regimens to do no harm or injustice to them, right? I want to benefit my patients according to my greatest ability and judgment. And here we go. Neither will I administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course. We just read in that UK law. What is the coordinating doctor doing? They are literally administering, handing over the approved substance. Remember, that's the NICE acronym for the poison, to the patient for them to self-administer. So this is a direct violation of the Hippocratic Oath, which, there are many things that you could highlight a bunch of things. I'm doing it here on the screen a little bit. There are a bunch of things that doctors today violate with respect to the Hippocratic Oath, but this would be yet another one of them, to not administer a poison to anybody when asked to do so or even suggest such a course. Doctors are here for our health. They are not here to give us poisons and to kill us. Okay, so there we go. We have talked about a lot of things today, all with respect to assisted suicide. Hopefully this was an enjoyable, maybe enjoyable, informative, helpful conversation. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. So please let me know what you think. I would also ask you, just as a final note, this is maybe a great cause to take up in your prayer life for the rest of Advent. Let's pray especially for people who are finding themselves in situations where they feel hopeless. Let's pray especially for people who are in medical situations that do cause them a lot of pain and suffering. Let's pray not only for a relief from their temporal symptoms. Let's pray ultimately for a relief of their eternal symptom, if you will, their lack of hope in Christ. And I know that it's easy for me to say, as someone who's not dealing with one of those terminal, agonizing conditions. It's easy to say, I have hope, and I don't know if I were in that situation if I would have hope. We can only know when we are in that situation. But I certainly would hope, if I were in that situation, that I would have people praying that I would have hope. And so let's do that. Let's make that a part of our prayer life over the next week and a half or so of Advent. As we say, "Come, Lord Jesus," may we pray that that's especially true for those who have no hope right now, or who feel that they have no hope, that Jesus Christ would be their ultimate hope. All right, I'll be back next week with more. Thank you so much for listening. As always, until next time, have a very blessed Advent, and I will talk to you soon.